we're going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank all of you that are here present so that we can share this conversation about our environment and the things that are damaging our environment. And I think the other thing is that we want to know what can we do to stop some of the attacks that we have on our environment. I want to share with you some of our experiences that we had in the Farm Workers Union so that we were able to stop some of the use of some of these pesticides. We know that 80% of the pesticides that are used in our farms. And it's unfortunate too, because I think most people don't realize that the poisons that are put on our food, and that's, the scientific name of pesticides is economic poisons. That's exactly what they're called, economic poisons. And people don't realize that these pesticides that are put on our food, the consumer might think, oh, well, maybe somebody out in the field is making sure that the crops are washed before they get into our supermarket. But we have to say to people, hey, they don't go through the car wash, right? The way that the lettuce is packed out there in the field, the way that the strawberries are put into the little boxes, the way that the grapes are packed, that is exactly the way they go to your supermarket. There is nothing in between that is going to cleanse those crops to make sure that they're safe for you to eat. And so we know, because we do not have the vigilance, we don't have the protections out there, that we in the United States of America, we have the highest cancer rate in the world. The highest cancer rate in the world. And it's interesting too, because some of the practices that we use in the United States are actually banned in other countries. I'm going to mention one particular gas called methyl bromide. Now, when you think of a gas, there's no way to stop a gas. It goes out into the atmosphere. And we know that this particular gas has been responsible for many deaths in the United States of America. And yet, Europe banned this pesticide decades ago, and we continue to use it in the United States. And of course, the reason that they can continue to use these pesticides and these gases like methyl bromide and others is because of the strong lobby that the agricultural department has, and of course many of the petroleum companies, the Farm Bureau Federation and others. And so there's just a lot of money that is being made on all of these poisons that are used on our food, and so that they continue to use them. I wanted to tell you about what happened to us several years ago, I should say back in the 80s, when actually we went door to door, going to the homes of the farm workers and asking them, have there been any disabilities in your household because of the use of these pesticides? What we found was horrifying, because there were children that were born without arms, without legs, with pieces of their spine missing, with fingers missing. It was horrible. And in fact, there was one family that we found that they had a fetus, basically, because when the child was born, it was, they didn't even have any eyes. I mean, these terrible things, and this was happening to the workers, and of course, the cancer rate among the farm workers themselves was extremely high. But all of this, prompted C.A.S.A. at that point in time, and this is, of course, before he passed away, that he actually did a 36-day water-only fast. He fasted for 36 days of water only because he wanted to bring to the attention of the world in the public about the children and the farm workers that were being killed by the use of these pesticides. And so one of the things, of course, we did in the farm workers movement was to make sure that we could get some of these pesticides banned. One of them, of course, way back in the early days of the 60s and the 70s, we were able to get DDT banned. Now, it was great to say, okay, we got it banned in the United States of America, but then what they did is they just took the DDT to Mexico and to other countries in Central America, and they used the DDT over there. And we know that DDT, which is a chlorinated hydrocarbon, that it has a half-life of over 60 years, so it takes forever for it to ever be able to get out of our environmental system. Now, we were more fortunate in getting some of these other organic phosphates banned, and so like Dinoseb and parathion. And I remember when I was negotiating contracts with the growers, on the fields, and we're talking about banning some of these pesticides, the use of these pesticides. And when we first started talking about parathion, they had a re-entry date of 7 days. that the workers could go back into the fields after 7 days after they sprayed parathine. And then they extended it to 14 days. And then they extended it to 30 days. And it wasn't until a whole group of farm workers were poisoned with parathine that we were finally able to get it banned entirely. And you know, the sad thing about some of these poisons is that they have been testing them on human beings. Hilda Solis, who was recently the head of the Department of Labor in the United States of America, and when she was a congressperson, they were actually going to put into an experimental field using students and farm workers, and they were going to spray them with a pesticide to see what the reaction to the pesticide was. Luckily, so Hilda Solis found out about this before they actually did it and was able to put a stop to it. But again, that shows kind of the disregard that there is for how these poisons are going to affect actual human beings. And so we know that there has to be a lot more that has to be done in this whole area. I remember once when we were in the field and a lot of farm workers were affected. Now this poison, that particular pesticide had already been banned. But what they did is they kind of changed it, and as you know, they said, well, now it's an improved pesticide. And when we went out to the field, and some of the reporters that went out there, we actually had TV crews go out there, and they said, well, the workers look all right to us. And I asked one of the workers to take off his shirt. They had actually used this pesticide in the citrus field. When he took off his shirt, his whole chest was full of blisters. And they had poisoned that whole entire crew with that particular pesticide. And eventually we were able to get that one banned also. But when we think of over the years, what these pesticides, the harmful effect that it has, especially on children. Because children, because their bodies are small, you know, their reaction is so much more vulnerable to the effect of these pesticides. And it is very tragic, especially for the farm worker children, to think how they're affected. And then we say, okay, well, maybe they're using these pesticides out there in the field. The fields are not close to the nearest town, but we have had neighborhood and towns here in the San Joaquin Valley, California, where an entire town, like a little town called Early Mart, one of the towns in the Central Valley, not too far from Delano, where the people in that entire town were poisoned with pesticides. Because the drip, it comes into the neighborhoods also, and it comes into the town, so there's no way to stop it. And I was mentioning earlier about methyl bromide. Well, they have a gas that was similar to methyl bromide, and we went to a hearing. Now, this was a hearing by the EPA, and you know what they were talking about? How they could build a fence and have some kind of a barrier. Now, I remember sitting in that hearing and thinking, what are we doing sitting here? We should be out there picketing this hearing, you know? Because this is so ridiculous. How can you put a fence to stop a gas? There's no way that you can do that, because the air is going to take that and it's going to drift, and it's going to drift into people's homes. And even today, we have discussions and arguments that are going on right now in many of our Central Valley school districts, talking about what they call barrier zones. Barrier zones. You know, how many hundreds of feet or hundreds of yards can you put between the school and the place where they spray these pesticides? Now the thing is this, that all the studies have shown that ultimately these pesticides don't really stop the pests anyway. They still lose about 25% of the crop to pesticides. And then to take it to the next level, when you have companies like Monsanto that have, you know, developed plants that have the pesticides in the plants, right? And this is supposed to be to keep the insects away. And then the other thing that they do is that they do this mass spraying to kill all of the so-called weeds. And what happens is, because they're going to protect certain crops, but then again, they saturate the ground with more pesticides. And some of the weeds that they kill are the weeds that actually, like the monarch butterflies, okay? They depend on the milkweed to be able to sustain themselves. But they have sprayed so many pesticides that have killed the milkweed, and so now the monarch butterflies, they don't have any food. And we see that the monarch butterflies have been decimated. been decimated and by millions of butterflies that used to travel, all across the United States and go down into Michoacan, into Mexico. And now the numbers have really, really dropped because of the pesticide that they used that killed the milkweed. So this is an ongoing problem that we have. And now I know that this has been going on for many generations right now. And so, we can celebrate and say, okay, we got rid of Dynacid, and we got rid of DDT, and we got rid of parathion, and some of the other pesticides that we call the dirty dozen. But guess what? They just come up with brand new ones, right? And we know that the testing itself is not done in a way that really guarantees that people are going to be safe. And it's kind of sad when you think that we in the United States, that we use more pesticides than anybody else in the world. Now, I think that the ultimate solution for pesticides ultimately is going to be that we have to put the application of pesticides, again, these economic poison, take it out of the EPA. Take it completely out of the EPA, take it out of the Department of Agriculture, and put it under the Health and Human Services. This is a health issue, and this should be put under Health and Human Services, taken out of the hands of agriculture and the EPA. We had a situation a few years ago, maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, where there was a plant that manufactured Dynacid, another cancer-causing pesticide, and we were able to ban Dynacid and completely make them stop using it. But the factory that they had contaminated the dirt. And this is a little town called Arvin, California. Many of you have, I think, seen the movie The Grapes of Wrath, right? If you haven't, see it again. But this is a little town right there where The Grapes of Wrath was filmed. And the pesticide, the Dynacid, had seeped into the dirt where they had actually manufactured, and it had contaminated the groundwater. And it had gone into 1, 2, 3 layers of groundwater. So it was now about going to go into the last layer of the groundwater, where the whole water supply of that town of Arvin, California would be contaminated with this Dynacid leftover, this pesticide. Well, what was the EPA going to do? They said, oh, we'll come in and we'll put in some kind of a clay floor in there so that it will get down to the water. But you know what? The workers in that area, they got together. There's a great organization called, it's called CRP, the Center for Race and Poverty Environment. And everybody got together in the town and we protested. EPA came out there and they were met with hundreds of people that were just yelling at them and saying, we want you to do something about this. So we were finally able, because of the fact that the community got together, that they had to take out all of the dirt that was contaminated. Completely took it completely out to make sure that groundwater would not be contaminated in that farmer community. So, this was of course very effective and we were able to make that happen. But actually when I was lobbying in Sacramento, this is way many years ago, back in the 70s, I was actually able to get a bill out of the state assembly that said just that. Take the pesticides and put them under the Department of Health. And got it out of the assembly, but they killed it in the Senate. And that was, 40 years ago. And here we are talking exactly about the same issues. And we know that when we talk about the pesticides contaminating our water, then that brings us into the whole other issue that we have right now about how can we keep our water pure and clean so that people will not be worried about that. Here in the Central Valley of California, of course, we're having a huge drought. It's been going on now for the last 4 years. So we now have in some communities that don't have any water at all, that they are now having the water trucked in, and they're going to have to provide water, just like they do in Mexico and some of the places over there. They have to truck the water in, and people have to bring their water bottles, and they have to fill them up because the water is gone. And it's kind of sad when we think that in California, I guess that one of the good things that's come out of this drought, that all of a sudden people are saying, hey, maybe we need to think about some conservation measures, okay? Because it's interesting that I remember, I don't know, I'd say people that might be in the audience are a little bit older, that some of you might remember when you were young, that our parents had a rain barrel when they used to catch the rainwater, and then people used that rainwater. I remember we used to use it to wash our hair, and then use some of that rainwater to wash clothes, etc. But we don't have that anymore. And in California, because of the drought, for the very first time, people are starting to think about, hey, why don't we think about water conservation? Another interesting factor that's happening in California is that you have some of our agricultural interests that own the water. How about that? They actually own the water. And some of them, even though they're saying, okay, we need more water, but then they turn around and they sell the water to some of the cities. So some of these same growers that are saying we need more water, they have water, and they turn around and they sell it to some of the cities. So when we think about water as a utility, that we cannot have life without water, and yet that we tend to take it for granted, and we don't think of preservation, and we don't think about how it's being distributed. We don't think about how some people can own water when this is a natural resource. How can that be that some people can own water and that other people can turn around and sell it at the same time that we don't have enough of the water? So I think that what you were doing in Colorado and Conejos is really, I think, an example for the rest of the country. So maybe people have to make an applause, all right? Let's do a big applause there. I see people pointing over there. It's obvious that you will be able to teach the rest of us, what we can do to conserve water. I remember going to New York once, and they had this play called, I don't know if you heard about this play called Urinetown. This is kind of a satirical play that they made about called Urinetown, which really people had to ration to be able to get water. And I remember seeing also a picture of our Earth, our whole entire Earth. We just look at the marble, and the blue marble, and they were showing the amount of water that we actually have to drink in the whole planet. And it's scary when you see how small the amount of water, fresh water, that we actually have on Earth. So, of course, here in California, they're talking about desalinating water so that we can have more water. Like right now, we've had this drought, and now we're having this huge rainy season, and that's just come because of El Nino. But then you see all of the water that's running off. It's just running off, and there's no method or no control about what are we going to do to try to conserve the water that we have. So this is a very, very scary issue for all of us to think about. I was fortunate enough to visit this school in Tucson, Arizona, and I don't know if people know about this place here, but this was a little grammar school in Tucson, Arizona, and they had cisterns. Arizona is a pretty dry place, as we know, and they had these water cisterns, huge cisterns on the school, and they captured all of the rainwater, and then with that water that they had, they were able to catch all of the rainwater, and they were able to use that rainwater not only for the use of the school there, but guess what? They also had gardens, and they had a garden for each one of the classes. And this was a grammar school, and it was so awesome to see the children. Every classroom in that school, every separate classroom had their own little plot of garden. And one of the classrooms was responsible to take care of the worms, right? And make sure that they were able to take care of the earth so they could fertilize the gardens. And then they had another one that had cucumbers, and one had tomatoes, and one had peppers, and one had kale. And each one of the little classrooms had their own garden that they tended. Oh, by the way, they also had solar panels, all right, at that school. Is an example for the rest of the Southwest on how not only can we conserve water, but then how we can also grow our own food. And by the way, all of the food that they were growing was organic. There were no pesticides on that food at all. And what a great example. If we could just duplicate this in many of our schools throughout the country and start educating everyone how we can grow food without pesticides, grow organic food and conserve water. All of these lessons all at the same time in terms of, again, preserving Mother Earth, to make sure that we do have a planet that is a safe environment for our children. I noticed that one of the issues that you have been talking about here is about the Bureau of Land Management and about people using what we call federal land for their own use. And that's a really, I think, an interesting concept because we know that there have been recently some spectacular wars about people that want to use the federal land for grazing cattle, etc. And somehow they think that we should be able to do that. And yet we know that President Obama has really been in the forefront of preserving as much of our federal land as we can and using it for international limits so we can preserve it for future generations. And I think that that's definitely an issue that all of us have to really step up to and support, that we can have our federal lands preserved and that they should not be used for commercial enterprise or commercial purposes. Some people want to use that commercial land to go for oil, for instance. And as I said before, some of them want to use it for grazing, but that means that that land is going to go to corporation and it really belongs to the people, and then it shouldn't be used that way. Just used for commercial purposes and taken away from us, basically the taxpayers who want to conserve those lands. So I think that's a great fight. I'm glad to see that many people are really involved in that fight. When we talk about these issues, I was just recently involved in the Gmo Labeling Fight. This is kind of interesting because in Washington, D.C., we were just able to kill this bill just recently. But what Monsanto did with some of their friends in the Congress, they introduced a bill that would prohibit any state or county from making GMO labeling mandatory. They're just the opposite of states' rights, right? I mean, because usually the conservatives say that, okay, states have the right to pass whatever laws that they want. Well, the bill that they had said no, because there have been several states, Vermont and some of the New England states, that have actually passed laws that said, yes, our foods that have been genetically modified should have a label on them. Now, we had that initiative here in California as a proposition, and all of the agricultural interests came up and, oh no, it's going to cost too much money to put labels on the food. Hey, when we go into the grocery store and we buy an avocado, it's got a little sticker on it, right? If you buy an apple, it's got a sticker on it. If you buy a banana, it's got a sticker on it. So they're already putting stickers on the food. Again, when American growers, our agricultural growers here, when they say it send food to Europe or they send food to Brazil and some of these other countries, they've got to put the labels on them if it's been genetically modified. Isn't that interesting? The food that they grow here, if it's genetically modified, it's got to have a label on it. If it goes to another country that already has these laws in place that says that the food has got to be labeled if it's genetically modified. And here in the United States, they're fighting to say it's too expensive, even though they put a sticker on all of these other foods that we purchase. So, and it shows how idiotic it is that our agricultural corporations here, they know they have to put the labels when they ship the food to other places, but they won't do it here in the United States. Now, I don't know how they get away with that. Well, I guess one of the ways that they get away with it is because elections matter, right? Elections matter. And the people that are elected to Congress are the ones that are make up these laws, or they go along and introduce this bill that Monsanto had to prevent the GMO labeling, got out of the House of Representatives, got out of the Senate Agriculture Committee, and was ready to be voted on the floor. And luckily, we were able to kill it at the last minute, okay? It was just by a thread that we were able to stop it. So, this again is another big thing we have to think about. When we talk about genetically modified foods, and I know there's been entire books that have been written on the subject, because we do have such a long lifespan as human beings, that it's really hard to tell exactly what the effect is going to be on our bodies in the long run. And right now, unfortunately, we know that a lot of our food, like soybeans, so many of the soybeans have been genetically modified already that it's I think probably even hard to find any kind of soybeans that have not been genetically modified. And we know that other countries like India and places like that, where many of the farmers, when these genetically modified seeds that they have, they actually are able to jump and go into other places, even though they're trying to stop from growing genetically modified crops. They actually are able to jump into the other areas, and they end up with these genetically modified plants, even though they have no desire to grow this kind of food. So I used to say all the time way back in the 70s, you know how the oil companies managed to get control of all of the oil and the energy that we have, and so we are so dependent on them to get the energy that we have. And when we think of companies like Monsanto that can kind of control the food supply, and they went in there and they bought all of these seeds. I remember the United Farm Workers at one time, we had contracts with many of these small seed companies. Well, you know what? They don't exist anymore. They don't exist anymore because the big corporations, again like Monsanto and the other ones, they have bought up all the seed supply. And so farmers are totally depend on those companies to get their seeds. And then the other thing too is that many of the seeds that they buy, they only use them for that one crop, and then they have to buy new seeds, right? For before you could actually get the seed and you could regenerate the seeds from the crops that you grew. But now that is also, so it seems to me, and maybe this is kind of a paranoid thought, that again, the way that we have the oil companies that control the oil supply, we have these corporations that are going to control our food supply, and we are going to be completely dependent on them. And that, again, is a very, very scary thought. The other thing, too, is when they control the seed supply, that means that before, when you had some certain crops, you had many varieties of a certain crop, and now you don't, because so many of those seeds, because they're not used anymore. And so I think that's like kind of a whole new movement, because there are some organizations that are just going out there and trying to find some of the seeds that have not been taken off the market and that they don't exist anymore. So, I guess it sounds like really dire news, right? And it seems like, okay, and it may be kind of depressing, but again, we have to go back and say that we've got to start getting people that elected to office that are actually going to protect us. They're going to protect our food. So they're going to protect our energy supplies, and definitely be able to protect our environment. And the thing is that when we talk about pesticides, there are alternatives. I remember going to Cuba, and in Cuba they have actually developed it's some kind of an application that they can put on the crops that is not oil-based, and it's not a pesticide. It's a plant-based, and they get it from a tree that grows in India. And it doesn't have any harmful effects on human beings. But because Cuba has had this economic boycott on it, where they cannot market some of the products that they developed, they have not been able to market this particular product. So one of the things we can do, of course, is to work with the Congress and petition the Congress and put pressure on them to end the economic boycott on Cuba. And then maybe that they can start marketing this particular formula that they have been able to develop to be able to put this application on our crops that is plant-based and that will actually be able to keep the pests away from destroying our food. And we know that there's other ways that they have actually been able to stop insects from killing the food, and that is by being able to rotate the crops, by being able to also, once that a crop is finished, of actually plowing under that particular harvested crop to make the ground stronger, more fertile, and then actually the crops that they grow then will be stronger and be more pest resistant. So I think that we have to try to, actually encourage these other types of practices that we call integrated pest management. Governor Jerry Brown, when he was elected the first time around in 1974, he actually I had people going out and talking to all of the farmers in California about trying to see if they could do some of these different types of integrated pest management practices to stop the growing use of pesticides. And I wish that I could say that after all of these years that we have actually been able to decrease the use of pesticides, but unfortunately, it hasn't. The use of pesticides continues to grow, and the reason, of course, is because there's a lot of money in it, right? It's sad. I remember once one of the small farmers that we had a contract with, and he was a really good person. He actually, he used to bring the workers over to his home. He wasn't like a big corporate farmer like we have in California. By the way, a small farmer in California usually has about 1,000 workers, right? We have these big corporations like the Dole company that has like 40,000 workers throughout the state of California. So when you talk about a small farmer here, it's maybe somebody who has a couple of hundred workers. And this particular gentleman did. And the sad thing about it is he died. He died at a very young age. Because he was a small farmer, and he would actually go into the vineyards and into citrus crop, and he would spray. He himself would go out there and spray his crops. And he died at a very young age. He was in his 50s when he passed away. But he died of cancer. Where did he get the cancer? He got that cancer from the pesticides that he sprayed. Then there was another farmer, and I actually went to his home. And he had been a pesticide salesman. He was the son of a grower. His father died, he took over the farm. But his career had been actually as a pesticide salesman. And if you ever get a chance and you look at some of these magazines that the farmers, like the Farm Bureau puts out, and when you look at the advertisements that they have for pesticides, it's like selling candy. They talk about, it's pesticide and how nice it is, and it's like a marketing strategy. And I remember when I sat down to this son of this farmer who took over Dad's farm, and we were talking about these pesticides, he had no clue. He didn't even know the scientific names of pesticides. He didn't know the difference between the chlorinated hydrocarbons like the DDT or the organic phosphates. No, didn't know. Then he invited me to come to his house, and his baby was in a crib, and that baby had issues. And I thought to myself, how sad, how ironic that this farmer who was selling pesticides took over his dad's farm, and now his own child had been affected by these pesticides. And again, it comes from ignorance, right? It comes from ignorance. So I think that this seminar that they're having today, this conversation that we're having today, I think is great, because this is what it is. People need to know. People need to know, because if we don't have the knowledge, then we really can't act on it, right? But then again, once we have the knowledge, then we can start acting on it. And I know that there in Colorado, you have some very progressive, and maybe some not so progressive, but you have some very progressive legislators that you have. I have met with your Senator Bennett, and in fact, he's one of the people that we met with on this GMO labeling to get his help on this. And I also know that Senator Bennett is one of the people that's being targeted, right? That they're trying to target him to try to get him out of the Senate. So again, when we come back and we talk about what can we do to change this, we've got to get some champions. We've got to get some people there in the Congress that will really stand up and will fight for the consumers and fight for the growers, fight for the farm workers, fight for our environment, and stand up to these practices and not let these giant lobbyists like Monsanto, like the Farm Bureau Federation, like the Western growers, and some of these big, very wealthy lobbyists come in there and intimidate our legislators so that they will be afraid to take on some of these issues. And so I know that all of you are going to be active, right, in the elections. I see people sparking up there and saying a big old yeah. And this is one of the things, of course, that we really advocate for. I like to say to people that, those of you that are there in the room, and if I ask the question, how many of you voted, Did I ask the question? How many of you voted? Let me see your hands. There they go. Okay, now I'm gonna ask another question. How out there and knocked on doors getting other people out to vote? I see those hands. All right, our hand number. I'd like to say that those of you that held your hands up, I'm sure that you were able to get anywhere from maybe 40 to maybe 60 people out to vote, by just going out there knocking on doors or doing the phone banking. So I would just say to the rest of you, please, in this next election, could you please all go out there and knock on doors or do the phone banking if you can. And I guess now you have the absentee ballots right in Colorado, right? Everybody votes absentee ballot. So I guess, just getting out there to make people turn in those absentee ballots, do that canvassing, do that phone banking, to make sure that we get the people elected. The other thing that I would like to also say, if you could just email in people and say to them that we want you to do something about these environmental threats that we have right now. Do something about these environmental threats to make sure that these bills that Monsanto and the other ag industry people are putting in there, and the oil industry, that they don't pass, that they know that they got your support, because if they don't hear from you, then they think that they don't have the support of the community to be able to stop these measures that are going out there right now.